Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Jodi Magness. And today's topic is based on her book titled The Archaeology of the Early Islamic Settlement in Palestine. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below and in the pinned comment just below that. And with that being said, Jodi, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, Jacob.
Can you start us off by giving us some background to the book?
Yeah, and actually, thank you for inviting me to talk about this book because it was published over 20 years ago in 2003, and I'll explain how that came about. But it was great to see that there's still some interest in this book after all this time. I will highlight for your listeners that it is a technical book, right? It's aimed at specialists, so it's not a book that I've written that was aimed at, sort of the general public. And so it's not like an easy read or something like that. But your invitation for the interview caused me to go back and take a look at it again, which I haven't done in a while. And I found out that, wow, this is actually pretty good. So, but the way that this book came about is it was actually a direct outgrowth of my PhD dissertation. So I don't often get to talk about my dissertation, which was on a topic that really bores most people who are not specialists. It was on pottery typology. And what that means is that as archaeologists, we need different methods of dating what we dig up. And one of the most common ways of dating is using pottery types. We dig up pieces of pottery and we use them to date what we dig up. But there's a big problem with that in that, unlike coins, for example, or radiocarbon dating, or even inscriptions, pottery doesn't carry a date, right? Potsherds don't have a date on them. So how, as archaeologists, do we date pottery? And that is a very long and painful and complicated process, because it means that as archaeologists, what we need to do is to go through excavated archaeological sites layer by layer and lay out the different pottery types that were found in each one. And then we can construct kind of a relative sequence of types. So the ones that are from earlier, lower layers are earlier, and then you work your way up. And then what we have to do is look for objects that are found in association with those pottery types that do carry a date. So whether it's coins or inscription or radiocarbon dating or whatever. And this has to be done for every type of pottery in every area and every period, bearing in mind that not all pottery types change at the same time. So pottery types do change over time, but they don't all change at the same time. So you might have cooking pots continuing to be the same for a while, whereas your tablewares would have changed in style. So what happens is that as a result, this leaves large chunks of time and space where local pottery types are not dated. And this is where my dissertation came in. So I wrote my dissertation on a typology of the late Roman and Byzantine pottery of Jerusalem. Basically, we're talking 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries AD. Nobody had ever done that because for those periods in Jerusalem and actually in the area around, archaeologists tended to rely on coins, for example, to date, or on inscriptions, things like that, and sort of ignored the pottery as a result. So I did a typology of that pottery from Jerusalem. And in the course of working on my dissertation, I discovered that some of the pottery types that previously had been thought to be Byzantine by archaeologists, meaning dating to, let's say, the 4th to 6th centuries, actually dated to the early Islamic period, to the period after the Muslim conquest of Palestine, which was between 634 and 640 AD, so first part of the 7th century. And that was, so that was my dissertation. I eventually revised it and published it as a book that was published in 1993. But in the course of doing that, I realized that since many of these pottery types that were previously thought to be Byzantine were actually early Islamic, so 7th, 8th century in date, that meant that there must be settlements or occupation levels at sites all over the country that had previously been thought to be Byzantine, but in fact were early Islamic. And so that then, as a result, would change our understanding of the transition from the Byzantine period, which was a period of Christian rule, to the early Islamic period. It would mean that there were many more early Islamic sites than had previously been thought. And this goes along with the sort of nature of scholarship at the time I started this research. And I want to point out again, I published this over 20 years ago, and I did the work on it even longer ago. So, not everything that I'm saying will necessarily be the case today. In other words, scholarly understandings and interpretations have changed in some cases since I originally published this. But at the time I was working on this, there was a widespread view among many Israeli archaeologists that the Muslim conquest of Palestine, again between 634 and 640, had been accompanied by a wave of destructions, violent destructions, and had resulted then in a steep decline in settlement in the country, that settlements were wiped out or that, they were depopulated. And so the picture was, that scholars thought, that archaeologists thought at the time was, well, we have a flourishing period of Byzantine settlement, followed by sort of a basic wipeout in the early Islamic period. And this picture was based partly on the lack of, resolution in dating the pottery types, the fact that the local pottery wasn't really dated correctly, if at all. But it was also influenced by other factors. And that includes, among other things, our ancient sources for the transition, which tended to skew Christian sources that were rather negative, towards the transition to power, and also modern scholarly concepts. Modern scholarly views and biases also influenced the understanding of the transition. So as a result, after I finished my dissertation, I thought, it would be really interesting to take a test case somewhere in the country and look at it very closely to see, do we have evidence for the transition? And does my theory sort of that we have more early Islamic settlement, does that sort of is that borne out by the evidence? And that is what led to this book. So I ultimately decided to focus on an area called Nahal Yatir, which is located in the sort of northeast Negev desert, a little bit to the sort of north and east of Beersheba, because that area had been surveyed by an Israeli archaeologist about a couple of decades earlier, and published. And that meant that I had access to that material because it was published. I could go back and look, check the pottery, and sort of check all the finds that went along with it. And that was the basis for this book. And then, I kind of then, as a result, used that as the core of my study, but then extended it to look at other areas, other parts of the country. So that was kind of the background to the book. And if anybody of your listeners actually goes and looks at the book, they'll see that there are chunks of it that are devoted to the dating of specific pieces of pottery from each region. I know you probably don't want me to continue to go on, but I do have to say one more.
No, it's fine.
Okay, thank you. And that is that the area Nahal Yatir, as I said, had been surveyed. So my re-examination of the material from that area was based on surveyed material. And I don't know if all your listeners are aware of the difference between archaeological excavation and survey. So a survey is when archaeologists simply walk along the top of the ground and pick up artifacts, pieces of pottery or whatever else that are lying on the surface of the ground without excavation, versus an excavation which focuses on a specific area. So surveys tend to cover fairly large areas, whereas an excavation will focus on a specific site within an area. So Nahal Yatir had been surveyed by an Israeli archaeologist named Yehuda Govrin, and again, it had been published. And I think actually overall, considering the framework, the time period that Govrin was working in, that he did a pretty good job on the survey. But there are inherent problems with trying to use survey material. And among the problems, and this actually might occur to some of you who are listening, among the problems are that when you pick up pieces of whatever is lying on top of the ground that may or may not be representative of what is under the ground, right? So what happened to bubble up or be plowed up or whatever from underground, that might not, be the same as the kind of things that you pick up on the ground. So you might have an over-representation of certain things on the ground versus what's actually underground. Another problem is that a lot of times, this is connected with the previous point, a lot of times when archaeologists are conducting surveys, or whoever it is that's doing the surveying, tend to focus on sort of the flashy things, the things that stick out, and you might miss things that don't necessarily stick out to you as you're walking along. And another problem is that most of the pottery that is picked up in survey, they're little pieces of pottery, they're called potsherds. Most of them are what we call non-diagnostic or undiagnostic pieces, meaning they're from parts of the pottery vessel that don't necessarily indicate the date of the pottery vessel, because in order to date pottery, we need to be able to visualize what the original pottery vessel looked like. And so typically the piece of the rim, or maybe a handle, or maybe part of the base, or if it's decorated, that will help. But just undecorated pieces from the middle of the body of the vessel, generally those are pretty impossible to date. So there are other problems as well, or I should say drawbacks to using survey material. And typically it's best to use survey material together with one or more excavations in that survey region. At any rate, when I say that I went back and revisited this material from the Nahal Yatir survey that had been conducted by Levine, that's what I mean. I went back and I looked at the pieces of pottery, basically, that he and his team had picked up when they were conducting the survey. So that's really, again, the core of the book. And then the rest of it sort of extends to look at some adjacent areas, like other parts of the Negev, and even other parts of the country, and even a little bit outside of the country going north into Syria. That's my little background spiel.
What is the earliest evidence of Islamic settlement in Palestine, and when did it happen?
Right. So let me here I'm going to get into another thing connected with the pottery. So first of all, okay, there's actually two big things here. So one thing is, and this relates directly to your question, how do we identify Islamic presence in the archaeological record? And you could ask the same thing for anybody else. I mean, you could say, how do I identify Jewish presence in the archaeological record, or Christian presence, right? So how do we identify Islamic presence in the archaeological record, especially at this very early period of transition to Islamic rule? For the most part, it's almost impossible. I mean, really, it's only possible when you have certain types of artifacts, or you find certain types of things. So for example, the best way is if you find a mosque, right? A mosque is a pretty good indicator of Islamic presence, and we actually do have a number of mosques from this very early period of transition, and I'll come back to that in just a second. It is also possible to identify Islamic presence if you have inscriptions or graffiti, and we also have that at a number of sites. We also have at Nitsana, which is a major town in the Negev desert, which I cover in my book, there's an archive of papyri there that include papyri that go into the early Islamic period. So when you have finds like that, you can then identify Islamic presence in the archaeological record. But for the most part, we don't find those sorts of things in archaeological remains. And so even if we have, let's say, the remains of, I don't know, a house that dates to the period after the Muslim conquest, unless we find some sort of very clear indication like that, we will not be able to identify the religious orientation, the religious identity of the occupants of that house. Now, this again connects in with the pottery, because pottery types change over time. They're dictated by style, just like everything else. So pottery styles change, the shapes change, the decorations change, the types change. The problem is, and this is what I found when I worked on my dissertation, The problem is that the types that previously were called Byzantine turned out to date from the middle of the 6th century, and the 6th century is still a Byzantine period, Christian rule, but turned out to date mostly from the mid-6th century to the end of the 7th century. And so the majority of the pottery types that are found at the sites that I dealt with that date to this period span the Byzantine to early Islamic transition, by which I mean that you cannot tell whether they date before the Muslim conquest or after the Muslim conquest. And even as you go into the 8th century, there does begin to be changes in the pottery types as you go into the 8th century, but there's also some continuity. So the pottery doesn't always give you a clear resolution, a clear answer as to whether, let's say, a certain structure dates to before the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, but before the Muslim conquest, or after the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, or even necessarily into the 8th century. And I mention that because, again, we do have a number of mosques, very early mosques, that clearly date to around the time of or shortly after the Muslim conquest. But because the finds associated with them cannot be more closely dated, for the most part, it is impossible to say that these mosques were built, they were definitely built, let's say, shortly after the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, as opposed to, let's say, going into the 8th century. For the most part, it's really hard to say that. And so you asked about the earliest, evidence of Muslim presence. So roughly, we would say sometime after 640, but possibly then going into the 8th century. So there's not really a clear answer for that in most of the cases.
What are the various proposed models for the Israelite and Muslim conquests?
Yeah, this was actually something that I noticed pretty early on as I was working on this project, which is sort of the way the archaeological evidence has been interpreted differently by archaeologists over the course of time. And so one of the things that it's really important for people to understand is that archaeology is not objective. Archaeology, just like everything else, is an interpretive process. So yes, you could say it's a fact that I'm holding a piece of pottery in my hand. And maybe you could say it's a fact that this piece of pottery dates to, let's say, the 6th to 7th century, maybe something like that. But how do you then interpret what that piece of pottery tells us, right? And so one of the things that I noticed pretty early as I was doing this research was that the way scholars have understood the transition from Byzantine Christian rule to early Islamic rule has changed over time, and that these different interpretations, very interestingly, in many ways parallel the way archaeologists have understood the transition from Canaanite rule to Israelite, to the Israelites. I can't say rule, let's say, but so basically, now let's go back in time, right? Back in, let's say, the 13th, 12th centuries BC, the country was Canaan and was inhabited by people called the Canaanites, right? Who sort of were divided into a series of little kind of city-states, if you wish, or, these sort of fortified strongholds with certain territory around them. And then at some point, again, if we follow the biblical account, a new people arrive, right, and settle down in the hill country, and they come to be called the Israelites, right, the Israelite tribes. And so I noticed that the way that transition from Canaanites to Israelites was understood by scholars and archaeologists in many ways paralleled the way that the transition from Byzantine Christian to early Islamic rule was understood. And if we go through, there have been a series of models, and I think it's maybe a little outdated today to talk about it in this way, but it was certainly very much alive when I was writing my book. So with regard to the Canaanite to Israelite transition, the sort of old classic model was the model of the sort of this conquest, right? A unified conquest. So the idea that this is, the idea that you get if you read the book of Joshua, for example, right? So the Israelites come in and, there are these big battles and they sort of defeat the Canaanites and then they take over these Canaanite cities. And accordingly, early on, and we're going back to people like William Foxwell Albright and Yigael Yadin, accordingly, the archaeological remains at certain sites were understood as reflecting this sort of violent conquest. Can think about sites like Hatzor, for example, which was excavated by Yadin. So there was that model, and as I said, when I was working on this project, there was still a widespread conception among many archaeologists in Israel that the transition to Islamic rule had been violent and accompanied by destructions, which is actually, by the way, not the case. A second model that we find in the sort of biblical tradition is the peaceful infiltration. This goes back to earlier scholars, Alt and Not, who visualize these Israelite tribes as coming in and infiltrating in the area of the Canaanite settlement, and that, them becoming the area of Israelite settlement. It's kind of interesting that in some ways, sort of modifications or variations of that model are still, I think it's fair to say, pretty widespread. This idea that, you have people coming in from outside and mixing with the locals, and they become known as, as sort of Israelites. And there was this, I should also say, these models were never explicitly applied to the Byzantine to early Islamic transition. I'm the one who did this, who kind of talks about this. But there are parallels with, again, the way scholars had understood the Byzantine to early Islamic transition. So, for example, the idea that the Byzantine Empire fell to the Muslims pretty easily because it was thought, or maybe some scholars still think this, because there were Arab tribes, not Islamic tribes, by the way, but Arab tribes that had already infiltrated this area under Byzantine rule and led to its weakening, and so intermingled, and then you have the spread of Islam eventually. So there was that model, and then there was a third model. Sorry. Oh yeah, this is a kind of a weird model. The third model is the peasant revolt model. This was a model that was kind of a Marxist model, was suggested by a scholar named George Mendenhall, who sort of suggested that, in fact, the Israelites had never come from the outside, that they were basically these lower class peasants living among the Canaanite population. And he identified them with the Apiru, and then they kind of rise up in revolt and then kind of take over. And there were some hints of that also, even in the Byzantine to Islamic transition understanding, with there being sort of these nomadic groups that were sort of living among the Byzantine population, the Byzantine Christian population. And then there's the fourth model is a kind of a model which this was suggested, and I don't even know if he believes this anymore. I haven't gone back to sort of track where these models went in recent years. But back at that time, Israel Finkelstein, who's a very well-known Israeli archaeologist, had kind of suggested a shifting model of shifting populations, and that in times when there was a strong centralized government, that you have these kind of major settlements, and then in times when the government weakens, the local populations become kind of nomadized, right? They start to wander around in order to support themselves. And he suggested that, and that actually, it was never explicitly applied to the Byzantine to early Islamic transition, but there are hints of it in some of the more recent, at that time, more recent understandings of the Byzantine to Israelite the Byzantine to early Islamic transition among some of my colleagues, and I discuss this in the book. It's an interesting idea. I don't actually think it quite works, because in my opinion, what we see, and I'm not the only one who has said this, in my opinion, what we see is that when there were strong, settlements in the area. Now I'm talking about, let's say, the area of the Negev. You find more evidence of nomadic or semi-nomadic presence around those settlements, because those nomadic or semi-nomadic populations actually support themselves through trade and jobs associated with those settlements. So the collapse of those settlements actually does not lead to an increase in that kind of nomadic or semi-nomadic presence, sort of filling in the gap. So I actually think the model doesn't work. The model as it was proposed does not work, at least for the Byzantine to early Islamic transition. Anyway, I'll tell you something as we're going along, and I just went through these models. Anybody who does any kind of social science studies, or maybe in some of the humanities, will be familiar with the idea of using models to interpret evidence. And of course, it's very common among many of my colleagues. It's not something that I've actually done a lot of in my own work. Here, I kind of thought it was interesting that we have these parallels, but it's not something that the whole book is about proposing a model and then trying to see whether the evidence fits that model. My approach is always kind of more the opposite. Let's start with the data and see where the data lead us. And in this case, let's see where the pottery leads us.
Can you tell us about the importance of Nahal Yatir and what the survey sites tell us about it?
Yeah, most people probably never heard of Nahal Yatir before today, and there's a good reason. It's not. I mean, the reason that I chose Nahal Yatir, as I kind of mentioned before, because it was a site. It was an area that fit the kind of research that I wanted to do, kind of, hope that it would answer the research questions that I was asking. I was looking for an area that had been already surveyed and published so that I had access to the material. I was looking for an area that was not overly peripheral, so not way out in, the southern desert or something like that, because that would not necessarily be representative of, settlement in general. But I did want an area that was in the southern part of the country, because another thing about pottery types is they're very regional. And having worked in Jerusalem before I started this project, the kind of pottery types that I was familiar with for this period were southern types and not northern types. Now more recently, I've been working in Galilee, and the pottery types in Galilee in this period are completely different from the pottery types in the south. So for all of those reasons, I chose Yatir. And I mean, it's an interesting region in the sense that it does get enough rain. It's kind of a marginal region. It's sort of the northern Negev desert, so it doesn't get a whole lot of rainfall, but it does get enough rainfall for dry farming. And in that regard, it's sensitive to population changes, right? If you don't have enough rain, then it's going to have a greater impact than, let's say, regions that have more sources of water or more rainfall. So in all those regards, it was, it suited my particular purposes. But otherwise, I wouldn't say that there's anything, super important about Nahal Yatir, about the area of Nahal Yatir in and of itself. And I'll just mention one more thing. Completely coincidentally, after I had started working on this, I was invited to co-direct excavations at a site called Khirbet Yatir, which is located in the area of Nahal Yatir. You can tell from the name. And that was very fortuitous because, as I mentioned earlier, it's always good to have an excavated site going along with the survey material. So that worked out well in the end. But it was not Khirbet Yatir was not included. The excavation was not included in this book. I finished writing the book before we finished the excavations.
What do we know about the Yatir religion during the Ottoman Turkish period?
The Yatir region. So one of the interesting things about working on the survey material and working in this region in general is a concept that's become quite sort of, I don't know if controversial, but kind of high profile. And that is this concept of an empty land, right? That at certain points in history, and this has been applied also to modern times, but it's also true for some ancient periods, that when new populations came in, the area was empty of inhabitants, and the new people who arrived took it over. And so what's interesting about this is that this was the impression that was given in the 20th century when Westerners came to this area. And it looked like it was pretty empty of settlement, that there weren't a lot of settlements there. There were maybe, some nomads, some Bedouins wandering around, but there weren't like a lot of permanent settlements, farms, villages, things like that. What's interesting is that if we go back, however, to the Ottoman archives, and one of the great things about the Ottomans, and I'm not a specialist on the Ottomans by far, but one of the great things is that they left a lot of archival material, particularly tax records and things like that, which enabled us to sort of see what populations were in certain areas over time, names and distribution of villages and towns and things like that, the kinds of crops that were being cultivated. And not so surprisingly, we see that in the 16th century, there was actually quite a bit of settlement. I don't want to give an impression of like huge settlements or anything like that, but there was quite a bit of settlement, some small towns or villages, farming going on in the area of Nahal Yatir. And that's because, in the 16th century, that's really a picture, I think, that's true of the Ottoman Empire overall. And what we do begin to see, especially in this area, maybe not only, is that over time, as the Ottoman Empire weakens and its control, especially of peripheral areas, weakens, that you begin to see, especially in peripheral areas, a decline in settlement because there's insecurity, raids and things like that. And so some of these regions are in fact abandoned or depopulated. So it wasn't the case that under Ottoman rule, the area of Nahal Yatir was always kind of empty or depopulated or had very few permanent settlements. What we see in Nahal Yatir is actually a process that has to do with the strength of the Ottoman Empire and the local government's ability to guarantee the security of the inhabitants. So that's what's kind of interesting about looking at Nahal Yatir in the Ottoman period. And I do have a section in the book where I also talk about distribution of settlements in comparison to what's going on a Greek island called Kea, also in the Ottoman period, where an archaeologist did a very interesting and informative study of the local tax documents there, and pointed out that absence of settlements does not always mean that there was nothing going on. In fact, to the contrary, it could be that there was large-scale cultivation, and therefore in those areas that were being cultivated, you have presence, you have cultivation, but not necessarily what we as archaeologists would look for, which is signs of permanent settlements, dwellings, roads, things like that. I don't think, by the way, that picture is necessarily true of the Khirbet Yatir region. I mean, I'm not saying that it was, this big cultivated area, but it also means that there are certain types of remains that might not be visible in the archaeological record or might be hard to detect in the archaeological record, and therefore might give to us as archaeologists a mistaken impression about presence during certain periods.
What do the limes in southeastern Judea tell us?
Yes, thank you. It's actually limes, but I know it looks like limes, but it's pronounced limes. And so this is a concept which is very sort of central to scholars who study the Roman frontier, the frontier of the Roman Empire. There's kind of a debate. I don't even know if it's still going on, but it was certainly going on when I wrote this book. There's a debate about trying to understand how the Romans fortified or protected the frontier of their empire. And of course, the area of Yatir was on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. And so the question is, was there kind of a fortified line to protect the border of the frontier, and that would is what we would call a limes, the limes. Or when the term limes is used, is it just kind of a frontier zone, so to speak? So those are two very different ways of understanding what the limes are. Now, what the limes is. Now we have Roman documents that indicate that there were in fact fortifications, there were in fact fortresses in the area of southeastern Judea, right? The area where Yatir is located, so more or less the sort of broader area. That there were, in fact, some big sort of fortresses or forts that protected this area. My interest in it was whether some other forts or sites in the region also belonged to the limes or not. Because when I, again, started this work, several sites had been excavated in the area that the excavators had associated with the limes that said, oh, these should also be included. And if we include these sites as part of the limes, it would indicate that the limes was actually a kind of a continuous fortified line, because these sites filled in the gaps between the ones that were known, as opposed to just referring to a more general frontier zone. So that's where my work came in and what I did in the book. And what I discovered in the course of looking at these sites was that they apparently didn't have anything to do with the limes, at least not with the limes of, let's say, the 4th and 5th centuries AD, which is typically, what these other forts had been dated to and are dated to. I found that most of the two of the key sites actually are later in date, latter 6th to 7th centuries. And some of them were actually much earlier in date, going all the way back to, let's say, the 1st century. So that's the part of the book that's on the limes. And anybody interested in sort of Roman military history or the frontier of the Roman Empire, that will be of interest to them. But again, my analysis is a kind of a detailed analysis of the dating of some very specific sites.
What is the geography of Negev?
Yeah, so most of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with a map of Israel today. The southern part, almost the half, right? The southern half of the country today is like this long, elongated triangle that ends in a point going down to the Red Sea, right? The Gulf of Aqaba, and that southern part of the country is called the Negev, which literally just means it's the southern part of the country. And there you go. Nice map. Thank you. And depending on, what you're talking about, Yatir is kind of on the periphery of what we might call the Negev today, even though in antiquity it actually was part of the Negev. But it's an area that's quite geographically and climatically diverse. And if I'm going to say in very, very general terms, roughly, as you go from north to south in that area, the amount of rainfall declines. So Yatir is located at the northern end of it. And so Yatir, the area of Yatir gets, more rainfall than if you start to move further south. The topography, and therefore, of course, the vegetation will change, but the topography also changes a lot as you move. So, for example, if you go to the western area, the northwest, close to the coast, you get like sand dunes and stuff like that. As you go, the area of Yatir is not particularly mountainous, by the way. It's got these kind of gentle rolling hills that are covered with this kind of fine deposit called loess, Loess. It's like a fine chalky dust. But as you go south into the heart of the Negev Desert, what's called the highlands, it becomes more rugged, more rocky. You get some major sort of canyons going through it. One of the biggest ones is Nahal Yatir, Zin. And then as you go south from there, you get into a much more arid area, and also an area with different kinds of rock. Instead of having, let's say, the sedimentary rocks that you have to the north, as you go south, you get into areas of sandstone and stuff like that. So it's topographically and climatically a very diverse area, even though probably to most people coming from the U.S. today, unless you come from, let's say, the Southwest in the U.S., it looks pretty desolate.
We have a super chat question from Solara Knight. Thank you for your super chat. Are ancient Philistines Israelites?
Thank you for that question. All right, so we've gone back to the Israelites. Huh? All right, so the short answer is no, but I'll explain it for you. So, and here I'm going to qualify and say that again, we're relying on two different sources for our information, and those sources may or may not be complementary and may or may not provide the same kinds of information. In fact, they usually provide different kinds of information. So we read about Israelites and Philistines in the biblical stories, right? The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. The archaeological remains in and of themselves do not say these people are Israelites, these people are Philistines. So when we identify Israelite versus Philistine presence, it's based on correlating archaeological remains with the descriptions in the biblical accounts, right? So having said all that, the Israelites were the population that come to be located in the central part of the country, which is, if you envision the country, again, it's this long, narrow country. Running through the center of the country like a backbone is a series of, is a mountain ridge. It's called the Judean Mountains or the Judean Hills. The Israelites, or the people who come to be called the Israelites, settled in and lived in that part of the country. So they're living in the hilly or mountainous interior part of the country. And where they came from, again, as I gave the models, it depends on who you ask, but I think a sort of moderate view today would be that at least some of those people originally came from areas outside, especially from the east and the south, and settled in the hill country and probably mingled with and merged with some of the existing Canaanite population, and they come to be known as Israelites. The Philistines did not. The Philistines were part of groups of people called the Sea Peoples, who came from somewhere in the area of the Aegean, either the area of Greece and the Greek islands, or the area of the western coast of Turkey, what is today Turkey, and the offshore islands there. And they then eventually settle along the coast. And it is the Philistines, who again are one of these peoples, who settle in the southern part of the coast, the southern coastal region, and eventually establish there a kingdom, which is the Philistine kingdom, which had 5 major cities. So they're actually populations that are different and that have different origins.
When do the Negev farms date?
Yeah, so going back to my period, the early Islamic period, centuries, millennia later than the Israelites. So the area of the Negev has, one of the things that I like to say about Israel is it's one of the most intensively explored countries on earth from an archaeological point of view. Practically every inch of the country has been documented in some way by archaeologists. So the survey material that I relied on from Nahal Yatir for my book, well, other areas have been surveyed by other archaeologists in very much the same way. And this is true also of areas in the Negev desert south of Yatir. And one of the things that archaeologists have noticed is that if you go into the heart of the Negev, the central Negev highlands, we have a fairly large number of farms and farmsteads that date to this period of the Byzantine to early Islamic transition. And there's been quite a bit of debate among archaeologists about the exact date of these farmsteads. So do they date to the Byzantine period or the period of Christian rule? Do they date to the early Islamic period? Do they date to both? Part of the problem here is, again, with the pottery, because the vast majority of the pottery that's found at in these farms is these local types that just have this very broad range. So what I think actually is that I think, first of all, that we can't usually say for sure. I mean, we can't give an exact date with certainty because of the nature of the pottery evidence. I should also, by the way, mention, and I meant to mention this before, that some of your listeners might be wondering, well, what about coins? And it's true, in some of these sites, we might find coins, as we're talking about the survey material or some of the excavations. But one of the problems with coins is that they tended to remain in circulation for a long time after they were minted in antiquity. So even if you find a 6th century coin as you're doing your survey or excavating the site, it may be that that coin was still in circulation in the 7th century and then was lost in the 7th century. It just gives you what we call a terminus post quem. So anyway, the resolution of the dating is very difficult. I do think that most of the sites that we see, we can date very sort of broadly from the 6th century to the 8th century within that range. And that means that they span that period. Some may have been established during the Byzantine period and continued into the early Islamic period. Some maybe were established only in the early Islamic period, so after the Muslim conquest. But I think overall it's a picture of this kind of, broad sort of 6th, 7th, and into the 8th centuries, and sometimes even later. I mean, there are some sites, some of these farms and farmsteads, where the ceramic evidence even indicates continuity of occupation into the 9th and 10th centuries.
What did Ehrman's excavations at Nitsana reveal?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things about the Negev is that there are a number of, they've been called cities in the past, but actually they're towns or even really large villages. But anyway, we'll call them towns. There are a number of towns in the Negev desert going all the way down into the middle of it in places you would not expect, that flourished during the Byzantine period and continued to be occupied into the early Islamic period. And one of these is a very important site called Nitsana. In Hebrew, in Greek, it's Nitsana, Nessana. It's a really interesting site because it was originally excavated back in the 1930s by an American expedition, the Colt expedition. And that expedition found an archive of papyri that had been deposited in one of the churches. And I alluded to this before. That archive of papyri included papyri that dated to the Byzantine period, but also the early Islamic period. The papyri are written in different languages, in Greek and in Arabic and in Aramaic. Very, very interesting, very important. And so in the book, I deal with the question of these Negev towns, and my question was sort of trying to counter the usual narrative that the Muslim conquest comes in and these towns are simply abandoned or destroyed or whatever, cease to exist. Is that in fact the case? So first of all, the Nitsana archive shows that there was certainly some continuity of occupation there beyond the Muslim conquest. But looking at the pottery and the pottery from there was never any full and final publication of the excavations by the Colt expedition. But from the sort of rather small amount that they did publish, it's clear that there was occupation at Nitsana, not just through the 8th century, but into the 9th and 10th centuries. And that's actually pretty interesting. So well into, the early Islamic period, centuries after the Muslim conquest, at a time when everybody thought, there's nothing there. And so what happened is that more recently, excavations, now I can't even remember when these were, it must have been like maybe in the 1990s, maybe it was a little earlier. An Israeli archaeologist named Don Ehrman conducted some excavations at Nitsana. And his excavations, by the way, were never published either. But some of the material ended up being published in a dissertation that was written by somebody, a graduate student at his university, which was Ben Gurion University. So I was able then to take a look at that. And the pottery that was published in that dissertation confirms my impression from the original Colt expedition that occupation here continued well beyond the Muslim conquest into, let's say, the 9th and 10th centuries. And it's very valuable in that regard. I hope one day somebody will publish all of the material from those excavations.
And in my final question, is there archaeological evidence for widespread and violent destructions during the Sassanid period and Muslim conquest of Palestine?
Right. So I didn't even talk about the Sassanid Persian invasion. And so just to give a little background to your listeners. So, the Muslim conquest of Palestine was between 634 and 640 AD. But not too long before that, there had been another invasion. And this one was, in fact, a violent invasion, an invasion of the sort of eastern frontier of what was at the time the Byzantine Empire. And this invasion is the Sassanid Persian invasion. The Sassanids were basically the successors of the ancient Persians. In 614 AD, they managed to overrun Syria and Palestine, and they then held on to the region, to the territory, until 627 AD, when the Byzantines retook it. And then not too long after that, the Muslims come in. So, our picture looking back, we have two events, right, very close to one another. And sometimes the resolution archaeologically isn't great. So if we have a destruction layer, let's say, can we associate it with the Sassanid Persian invasion in 614, or is that destruction associated with the Muslim conquest in 634 to 640? You can see where the problem would be there. Well, okay, so let me say that I do think that we have archaeological evidence in various places for destruction by the Sassanid Persians. And I think that is most clearly identified in places like Jerusalem, some of the major cities, possibly at Caesarea Maritima. In the cases of the sites that I looked at in my book, however, I did not find clear evidence of any destruction associated with the Sassanid Persian invasion. And nowhere did I find evidence of widespread destruction associated with the Muslim conquest. So the picture instead is that the Muslim conquest was largely a peaceful transition. There are places, by the way, where we know that there was a peaceful transition. Jerusalem surrendered peacefully to the Muslims. They negotiated settlement. Caesarea, not so much. Caesarea was besieged by the Muslims for 7 months. But at the end, the Byzantine aristocracy packed up and abandoned the city in ships, and the city was taken over by the Muslims. So overall, there is not really evidence of any kind of widespread destruction or decline afterwards associated with the Muslim conquest. And that was one of the big things that I tried to pull out in my book, which is that this idea that not only were there no widespread destructions associated with the Muslim conquest, but that afterwards we do not have a period of decline in settlement. There are changes in settlement patterns over the course of time, but there's no evidence of like an overall kind of decline and depopulation or anything like that.
And just to remind everybody real quick, that the link to purchase the archaeology of the early Islamic settlement in Palestine will be provided in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment just below that. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Jodi.
Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.